Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Lynn Bartley. Is that who I am today? I'm Lynn Bartley, Viewmeister, along with Don Cooney, who is in the social work department at Western Michigan University and also City Commissioner, and Ron Kramer, who is the director of the Criminal Justice Program at Western Michigan University. We hope to spend some time today talking about Amy Klein's new book entitled The Shock Doctrine, and we intend to dovetail it with some information about Rumsfeld's trip to France. And things are not going well with the Mukasey nomination, and we want to spend some time talking about that. And we have some interesting things to say about Blackwater. We have been talking about the shock doctrine amongst ourselves for several weeks and months now, and I have gotten through most of it. Ron, I know you have almost finished it, and we think it's a very important book. And I want to say that I went to a place where I always know I can find help, and that's Amy Goodman's program, which is on every day here in Kalamazoo and also in Portage. And I wanted to give you an idea about the book, and I think I'll just take one of the sections from a question that Amy asked Naomi Klein. She asked her what this book is about and what is the shock doctrine. And she says, all doctrines, like all doctrines, it is a philosophy of power. It is a philosophy about how to achieve your political and economic goals, and this is a philosophy that holds the best way, the best time to push through radical free market ideas in the aftermath of a major shock, and we'll spend some time talking about that. Now, that shock could be an economic meltdown, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a terrorist attack, it could be a war. But the idea, as you just saw in the film, she plays one of the films, which is sort of a short clip about the shock doctrine. These disasters, these shocks, soften up the whole society. They discombobulate them, people lose their bearings, and a window opens up, just like the window in an interrogation chamber. And in that window, you can push through what economists call economic shock therapy. That's the sort of extreme country makeovers. It's everything all at once. It's not, you know, one reform here, one reform there, but the kind of radical change that we saw in Russia in the 1990s, that Paul Bremer tried to push through in Iraq after the invasion. So that's the shock doctrine. And that's what we hope to talk with you all about more today. Ron, you have looked at the book. You've been encouraging me to look at it, which I did. What's your response?
Well, I've been very interested in the book because I think it's a great illustration of a concept that I've been writing about myself, which is state corporate crime, the way in which corporations and governments work together to produce various kinds of illegal acts or various kinds of social harms. And I think Naomi Klein's book about disaster capitalism is about sort of macro forms of state corporate crime as they occur around the world. The term shock doctrine has three separate meanings in the book for Klein. The first is the idea that there is some kind of an event, as you alluded to in her statement. It might be a coup, a political coup. It could be a terrorist attack. It could be a war, an invasion. It could be a natural disaster like Katrina or the tsunami. It could be the the revolution that occurred in the Soviet Union with the breakdown of the Soviet Union. There's some kind of an event that occurs that, as she says, softens up the people or provides space or the opportunity for a sweeping change in economic and political policies to be implemented. And the policies that are usually attempted to be implemented at this point by elites, political and corporate elites around the world, are the doctrines of sort of radical free market policy for radical free market doctrine as espoused by Milton Friedman and the famous or infamous University of Chicago economics department.
Yes.
And in fact, the term Chicago boys comes up over and over in the book. These are people who have been trained at the University of Chicago in the economic doctrines of Friedman. And of course, Friedman's whole notion is that there should be extreme privatization, that the role of government should be stripped down to its bare minimum, and the forces of the market should be totally free to take over and run the economy, and that if you do this, this is going to produce great benefit and gain.
Yeah.
Of course, in practice, what this does is tends to produce massive wealth for corporations and the economic and political elite, and total immiseration for the workers and the rest of the people in the society. It produces massive structural economic inequalities. But so the first shock is simply the event that opens up that political space. The second shock is the shock therapy of the Friedmanite economic policy, the radical free market policies. And usually these include things such as extreme privatization, including even stripping away some of the core functions of government to privatization. Increasingly, as we're going to see in our own society, many of the core functions of government, such as fighting wars and providing homeland security, have been privatized.
And we'll touch upon the Blackwater issue here in a little while.
Blackwater certainly comes into play, and Klein discusses the private contractors in Blackwater quite a bit in the book. So the second shock then is the implementation of the shock therapy, the Friedmanite radical free market policies. And then because these policies are so unpopular and because they do produce tremendous economic inequalities, people generally tend to resist them. You know, this can't happen in a democratic fashion. People are not going to vote for these kinds of policies, and they're not going to allow these policies to be implemented without a fight. And so there often is resistance. And so the third shock then is the shock of government or state repression of those who are attempting to resist these policies. And of course, in Chile, we saw torture and mass imprisonment and assassinations and disappearances. And you know, but again, if people are going to resist, there have to be some effort to put down this resistance. And often it takes a very brutal form. And so that's the third kind of shock. So there are the three shocks: the shock of the event that opens up the political opportunity, the shock therapy of the economic doctrine being implemented, and then the shock of the government repression that's necessary to keep people from resisting these changes.
Yeah. Wow. It's all too true. I mean, we've seen it played out so many different times. And it all results in the continued control of the international economic system by the people that already have power, and the other people end up much not only diminished in their wealth, but also diminished in their quality of life and their opportunity to compete in the world. That's where it ends up.
Yeah. And in the book, Klein goes literally around the world providing concrete examples with a lot of historical and empirical data to substantiate the major thesis of the book. So she starts with Chile and Argentina, the southern cone in South America. Bolivia is another case. She goes over eventually to Poland after the Solidarity revolution, the way in which the Soviet Union disintegrated, and then of course the new policies being implemented by the new Russian government under Yeltsin. Eventually South Africa after apartheid falls. She comes back to the United States looking at what happened after 9/11 and the whole privatization of homeland security. She has several chapters on the invasion of Iraq. And remember the bombing campaign that we carried out in Iraq, what was it called?
Shock and awe.
Shock and awe, right? And of course, after the shock and awe, that created space for the occupation. And what happened during the occupation, and we've talked about that on this program numerous times, when the Coalition Provisional Authority came in under Paul Bremer, he began to issue all kinds of sweeping orders, which essentially tore up the economic and political system of Iraq and tried to totally reconstitute it. And of course, this is illegal under international law. You're not allowed as an occupying power to totally destroy the previous economic order and recreate or reinstitute a new economic order for a society. But that's exactly what we did in Iraq. And of course, we opened it up for all kinds of private corporations to come in. And of course, the socialist government in Iraq, the state-run industries and the state subsidies that were totally eliminated, which threw massive numbers of Iraqis out of work. The army was disbanded, remember, and it allowed for the opening up and penetration by foreign multinational corporations, so the Iraqi people were shut out of the reconstruction process. And again, it created enormous wealth for the private contractors and private corporations that came in. But the Iraqi people have seen little or no benefit for these efforts. And of course, it fostered even more violence in Iraq at the time. And so the Shock Doctrine, and of course the Iraqis resisted, and when they resisted and started the greater level of the insurgency, what happened? Abu Ghraib prison and the torture that took place there, and the massive effort to put down the resistance of the Iraqi people to the attempted implementation of the new economic order and the new political order in their country. So I mean, it's a perfect illustration of what Klein is talking about with regard to the Shock Doctrine. But she also looks at some of the natural disasters, the Hurricane Katrina and what took place in New Orleans after that. Again, the federal government failed massively to respond to the Katrina disaster, and then in the effort to rebuild New Orleans, what did they do? They opened it up for private contractors to come in. Blackwater came in actually and provided security. Halliburton was brought in. And they privatized the school system. They laid off massive numbers of public school teachers and government employees and brought in private contractors to handle it. And of course, these contractors got enormous contracts, enormous amounts of profits. And what's happened to the people of New Orleans? They've gotten almost nothing in return for all of this. And it's really a form of crony capitalism is what it is. But the argument is that the private sector can come in and do this much better than the public sector, but in fact it's just a gigantic ripoff, and the people end up holding the bag with little or nothing to gain from it. The tsunami that hit over in the Indian Ocean, she focuses in on Sri Lanka in particular, and of course there were lots of fishing villages that dotted the beaches there. And the government of Sri Lanka had long wanted to grab those beaches and allow for the hotel industry to come in and the tourism industry to come in. And they always met a lot of resistance. Plus, there was a civil war going on there. You know, the Tamil Tigers were fighting against the government there. So what happened is that the tsunami did their work for them. It came in and it destroyed all the fishing villages and drove the people away. And then they wouldn't allow the people to come back. They wouldn't allow them to come back in. They forced them to relocate in these camps, and they basically then turned over the beaches to the hotel and tourism industry to create Sri Lanka as a tourism mecca for the wealthy elite around the world to come and play.
Gentrified.
So the shock of the tsunami, then the economic shock therapy, and then of course the people resist that, and so the government now is having to put down the resistance of the people in Sri Lanka to these economic developments and basically the theft of their land and their livelihood. So all over the world, this is happening, and she does a tremendous job of documenting empirically these things that are happening in all these different locations. So
it's a magnificent paradigm, it really is. It really does give you the framework in which you can analyze all those different things that are going on. It becomes the common sense that when we have to rebuild the country, this is the only way we can do it. So it goes in there, and it's disheartening that American people don't do the analysis and look at what's happened because the results are so clear. We have that increasing gap, and just like you were talking about, but it's very insightful, and does help us understand so much of how the international system is structured and how the United States is structured.
And we've talked about it here and in other places, and how do you get people to understand that democracy and capitalism do not
the same.
Have to go together. One is not actually dependent on the other, and I think that's that's really part of this radical sort of Chicago school of economics, isn't it? That they are interwoven. You cannot get them apart, and you shouldn't take them apart.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Now, Milton Friedman was famous for talking about freedom, right?
Yeah.
Free to choose. That
Right.
was
Free
the,
to choose.
Free
That's
to
his
choose
book.
was
Yeah,
his
it's a great
book, and the idea that freedom is, what these economic policies are all about. But it's a very narrow conception of freedom. It's freedom for the capitalists. It's freedom for the investors. It's freedom for the corporation to come in and set up an economic system in which they are free from any kind of government interference, free from any kind of democratic input.
Right.
Okay, so really it means that there is an opposition between these kinds of economic policies and democracy. You can't have a truly functioning democracy and still think that these policies are going to be democratically enacted and imposed on people. And so free to choose, but it's a very limited and narrow kind of freedom, and it really is the antithesis of democracy, which is why, again, you have to wait for some kind of disaster to occur in order to then take advantage of that shock to impose these economic policies, because people are not going to voluntarily vote to take these things on. They're not.
It's a big loss for them.
Yes, yes. And that's why, again, you have to then counter the resistance of the people to these policies to keep them in place, to maintain them. And what's happened, of course, is that the international financial community has been brought in, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. I mean, these were institutions set up by the United States at the end of World War II. They were supposed to help bring back the economies of the world and to promote trade and investment. And what's happened, as Klein demonstrates, is that these international financial institutions have been taken over by the Chicago boys, by people who follow Friedman's economic doctrines. And so now the third world nations who find themselves with huge and crushing debt, or want to start some kind of development projects, and they have to go and work with these international financial institutions to get loans and so forth, they find that what's demanded of them to get the assistance that they need is that they have to impose these policies. They have to strip away the core functions of government. They've got to privatize things. They've got to deregulate everything. They've got to cut taxes. And then they've got to allow for penetration of foreign corporations to come in. And they're not allowed to really take care of their own people. They have to take care of the foreign economic corporations that come in first and foremost. And then, of course, they're told that this eventually will promote prosperity for their people, but of course it never happens. You know, the foreign corporations come in and take what they want and get out, and they produce a few jobs for the people for a while, perhaps. More likely what they're going to produce are sweatshops and other kinds of operations like that, and then eventually the people find that they're no better off economically than they were prior to that. And so, and what happens is that often they have to produce crops for export rather than crops for their own domestic use. And so they have to switch over and produce crops that are more amenable to export policy, and so then you end up with some food crises sometimes in these countries. They can't feed their own people because they've had to convert their crops over for the export market, and it ends up being, well, again, the term disaster capitalism. I mean, it has two meanings there. Disaster capitalism means that they take advantage of disasters to impose these terms of capitalism, and then it results in disaster quite often for the people of these countries. And these international financial institutions are part of the game now.
Well, what's the role of the state in this framework? It seems like it's sort of really cut down to almost nothing, and that it is almost a corporate functionary in this kind of picture here.
Yeah, the state plays two important roles. The state has to seize the opportunity that's provided by whatever disaster has occurred, whatever shock situation has arisen. Let's say, Pinochet takes power as a result of the coup. They overthrow the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. And so now Pinochet is in charge, the military is in charge, so now the state is setting up the new economic order and inviting in the Milton Friedmans of the world to advise them, and setting up Chicago boys as the primary government officials who were in charge of organizing or reorganizing their economy. So they're setting the stage for the implementation of the economic shock therapy. And then the second role that the government plays, of course, is when people ultimately resist the implementation of the economic shock therapy, then the government has to play the role of repressing that dissent and that resistance. So the government plays two very important roles there. And often what happens is that government leaders find themselves trapped. Even if government leaders come to power not intending to do this, they're trapped. She gives the great example of what happened in Bolivia. I mean, the guy who won the election, I can't remember the name right now, I should know it, but the guy who won the election in Bolivia had a record of not advocating these kind of policies, but once he got in power, then he realized the only way he was going to pull Bolivia out of its economic doldrums and bring in the needed investment and deal with their crushing debt was to follow the advice of the Chicago boys. And so he did. And then, of course, the people resisted, so they had to repress them. And even you know the situation in South Africa. Even after apartheid fell and Mandela became president, they were trapped in the same kind of a situation.
Right. And right after the apartheid, Mandela was released from prison and they were moving toward the apartheid. There were really two different people who were advocating for totally different economic systems. There was a guy named Chris Hani, who was a fighter, a communist, and advocated for a socialist system. And the other was Thabo Mbeki, who had been trained at the London School of Economics and was a capitalist. And Chris Hani was murdered in his driveway within a month after Mandela was left from prison, because they want to make sure that didn't happen. And who did it? We don't know who did it.
Right.
But now, and when Mandela, so many activists talked with him, I know I was in a room where people were asking him and talking about moving in with the corporations, and just like you said, Ron, he says, I don't know what else to do. I have to have capital. I have to have money. And this is the only place that I can get money. So these people also control the international lending institutions, and they're not going to give that money there unless you follow this kind of a doctrine. And that's what all the structural adjustment is about and all those kinds of things. And the consequences have been awful. I mean, what's happening now, the number of people in South Africa that are living on less than $600 a year is huge. And Krugman talked about that, I think, in his article today. I'm not sure. Maybe it's another day. But this produces wealth, but it doesn't produce a high quality of life for the people. And that's the struggle.
Well, when all of the government services are privatized, or most all of them are privatized, then, and thinking about what the function of the government becomes at that point in time, it means that some of the needed services either are privatized and you pay for them, or you don't get them at all.
Right, that's right.
And that's where I see the trap that you're talking about, because you cannot go and appeal to the government that you're being treated badly, because these privatized companies are the government in effect.
You lose control. You lose control. In the contract, they have that now, and you can't. It's very difficult to get out of that contract.
Yeah, public money, tax money is taken and handed over to the private corporations to provide functions that traditionally the government had provided. And so it's the people's own tax money that's being used to enrich the corporations who are supposed to provide the services. And of course the notion is that the private corporations can always provide the same services more effectively and efficiently. But of course that's never true.
Never.
Because you first of all have to factor in the profit margin, right? I mean, let's say the government has that pot of money to invest in taking care of its people. Well, then all of that money can be used in that particular project. But if you're going to hand it over to a private corporation, now a big part of that money has to be cut out of there and given over to the corporations for their profit. So that means there's a considerable less money available to handle the jobs. And that means, of course, that the wages for the workers will probably have to go down. And where does that profit? That profit has to come from someplace.
Exactly.
And the idea that somehow that's going to be more effective and efficient is completely demolished in the book, because she shows how what it usually does is opens the door up for massive corruption. You know, one company gets a huge contract, they subcontract it out to somebody else, who subcontract it out to somebody else, and then finally you get down to somebody who really does the work, and they get paid peanuts for doing the actual work, and of course then the actual work doesn't get done. Just like in Iraq, almost all of the work that's been necessary for the reconstruction has not been done. Massive amounts of money have been spent for reconstruction, and yet what are the results? Almost nothing for the Iraqi people. They don't have electricity, you know, they don't have water, they, you know, they have almost nothing.
I was very interested and wondered, you know, how you all responded to this, and that is her discussion of Nixon and Friedman. That Nixon's statement, "We're all Keynesians now," seemed to have been a very big disappointment to Nixon. But what he did was to shift this shock doctrine to Central and South America and other places. So he was afraid he wasn't going to get elected here if he employed some of these methods here.
Right. She does discuss Nixon. She also discusses Thatcher and Reagan. And of course, these are all people who bought into the overall philosophy but found it almost impossible to fully implement within their democratic systems because of the resistance, the political resistance that they encountered. And so, you know, when push came to shove, Nixon actually went in a sort of a different direction, imposed wage and price controls, if you remember, and you know, Friedman just was aghast at that, and you know, Thatcher was encouraged to go this route, and she thought she couldn't do it because she'd have a revolution on her hands. I mean, she implemented as much of it as she could, and so did Reagan. I mean, Reagan came in and fired the PATCO union, the air traffic controllers, and so there was some effort to begin to implement these things, but always there was tremendous resistance within the democratic political system that made it impossible. That's why it takes the almost complete shock of the natural disaster or the revolution or the political coup to provide the political space to implement the shock therapy. And unless you have that opening, you can't do it within a normal democratic political system generally.
I was quite interested in her paralleling that shock treatment with the physical methods that are used, and paralleling the kind of the disorientation, the creation of instability. You know, the Elian Gonzalez recapturing him takes place at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And I've heard reports over and over again that people are awakened in the middle of the night with these horrendous, powerful tactics that are used. And depending on what country, they're hooded, they're disoriented. They have no opportunity to balance themselves in any way as individuals. And that how important this that dimension of that process is in dealing with this shock doctrine. But we have just a couple of more minutes, and I'd like to finish up part of this, but I want to return to this again when we come back. And I was very surprised to learn that Rumsfeld and how much time he had spent sort of at the feet of Friedman, and that it now makes so much more sense with his behavior in Iraq. Did you have a response to that too, Ron?
Well, just that I mean, it's just very consistent. I mean, you can see if we look at what happened in Iraq, we can certainly see how it fits into the overall thesis that Klein has outlined. And it's not surprising to find that the people that were carrying out Iraq were in fact people who had been influenced by Friedman's doctrine. And so you know, what we got in Iraq was exactly that application of the radical shock therapy that Friedman had proposed. And
so the streamlining of the military, and the greater reliance on technology, which of course came from the private sector. And at least the contracts were there.
Yeah, and the privatization of the Pentagon itself. I mean, the stripping away of traditional functions and handing them over to defense contractors of one kind or another, Blackwater included.
Okay, we're going to have to come back to this in a moment. Thank you very much for being with us. We'll return in just a moment. Welcome back to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. We were talking about Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. And we had reached a point where we were talking about the privatizing forces in this doctrine. And Milton Friedman's approach, in which he reduced the functions of government to almost its lowest or weakest points, and that everything else should be privatized. And I was quite interested in learning that there was a strong connection between Friedman and Rumsfeld, who of course privatized everything he could out of the Pentagon, and that he had was a personal friend of Friedman's, and that he had spent every birthday with Friedman that he could. And to me, it clearly indicates how, whether it's a grassroots organization or a national issue that we're talking about, how important access is.
Yeah.
This is an issue of people like us are not going to have the kind of access that is represented by a philosophy, the Shock Doctrine philosophy, being implemented in the way that it is. We're not going to have much power to contravene in ways, because this is taking place sort of in private arenas, even though it's the public government.
They're not subject to Freedom of Information Act kinds of things, all that.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me that, again, that Rumsfeld has appeared in the news. And
just one final point on this. It's also that shows the power of ideas.
Right.
Right? Because,
yes.
I mean, Friedman was a brilliant man and had developed a very elaborate economic system and a whole set of ideas. And here's a quote from Friedman that Naomi Klein has on the jacket cover. And it says, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." And Friedman worked very hard to make sure his ideas were lying around, waiting to be used, waiting to be implemented when the proper time came about, when the crisis occurred. So it shows the power of ideas, and of course, being able to take advantage of opportunities relies on that access, but Friedman worked very hard to make sure that both the access was available and the ideas were there when the crisis occurred.
You know, what it made me think of was I wondered, and it's maybe just my suspicious mind, but I wondered how long the Patriot Act had just been lying around prior to the time it came into use following the bombing or the airplane attacks on the World Trade Center.
Yeah, most of it had been written prior to it. It wasn't created just after 9/11. Most of those ideas had already been written down, but politically it wasn't going to fly at that point. But they were lying around waiting for the crisis to occur so they could be implemented.
Lying around for a long time. I'm reading a book now called Legacy of Ashes by a guy named Tim Weiner, which is a history of the CIA. And he went through 50,000 pages of CIA documents to look at this thing. But the question that was asked from the time of Eisenhower was, how do you balance national security with democracy? And that's what they tried to wrestle with, and they wouldn't tell the people any of this. But even in the 60s, they were opening people's mail back then, and it wasn't until later that some of the documents were uncovered. So it has been lying around. This idea has been lying around. After the Second World War, they felt very clearly that unless they had They didn't have access to the information that they needed, and they had to find a way to do it. So how do you balance these two things out? And so I think the Patriot Act is the logical consequence of what they were talking about.
Well, and how much this calls forth in our minds, since we went through the Vietnam era.
Exactly.
And learning about COINTELPRO.
Yes.
This
and
is
that
simply, again, it's something lying around.
Right.
And it's been put to use, and now we get a reintroduction of that kind of approach to getting into people's privacy.
COINTELPRO, the thing about that for me was that it was brought about because people broke into an FBI office and the goods were out there. And the government reacted very strongly then. I mean, we had the church committee who put in some very strong restrictions, which were chafing these guys ever since then. And now, with the shock of 9/11 again, they saw the opportunity to move in that direction.
Elaborate a little bit on that chafing, Don, because I think I'm taking it to mean that you're connecting that with presidential powers.
Oh yeah, I think that there's always, and with the CIA, and the FBI, who always want to be able to have that information and access to it, but can't make that public because people won't accept it. And when it did become public, people did react against it. But I think that that they saw the opportunity with 9/11 to move in that direction.
So we all need to be sure to have some good things lying around.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's a point. I mean, I think the political right in the United States has done a very good job of making sure that their ideas are developed and available and disseminated. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of money poured into all kinds of think tanks and funding of scholars and funding of journalists on the right to propagate these ideas. And
the media?
The left has not done that same kind of work and effort. Of course, we don't have the money on the left
That's
to
the thing.
do this.
We don't have the resources.
You know,
and
we
some
don't.
of those principles we wouldn't violate.
That's right. That's right.
But the ideas are there and they're being developed, and you have you know, the SCAFE Foundation and the Heritage Foundation and all those think tanks on the right, and they bring in people and pay them a lot of money to write books and generate articles and do shoddy research sometimes to propagate the ideas and make sure that they're out there and they're lying around when the crisis hits.
And look how we've done that in Iraq, paying reporters to write articles that are friendly to the smiling pictures that the administration wanted, and then those filtering back into the United States. I mean, it's the boomerang effect is critical. We've wandered a little ways
let me
away
get
here.
one more thing on that. On that one point, there was a philosopher in 1800s who said the ideas of every age, the ruling ideas of every age are the ideas of the ruling class.
Yeah, right.
Mr. Marx said that, I think, right? I mean, and that's just, they're more sophisticated in how they carry that out today.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Should we get back to Mr. Rumsfeld?
Let's get back to Mr.
Rumsfeld.
Donald made a trip to France recently. And while he was on French soil, a number of human rights groups went to the court of first instance and basically filed charges against him for torture, for allowing torture and developing torture policies in Iraq, the Abu Ghraib prison, and also at Guantanamo Bay. And they accused him of violating the 1984 Convention Against Torture, which both the United States and France have signed and ratified. And torture is a crime of universal jurisdiction, which means that nations are supposed to be required to enforce the 1984 Convention Against Torture, so they're supposed to take action. Now, the French government, the French courts have taken no action yet, and probably under the new president, Nicolas Sarkozy, they probably will not. But nonetheless, while he was in France, their charges were filed by numerous human rights groups against Rumsfeld. And this is not the first time that this has happened. Twice before in Germany, similar charges have been filed. Someplace in South America and one other place, there have been 5 instances in which charges have been filed. Now, one of these days, this is going to stick. one of these days a court is going to take up this issue, and they're going to basically issue an indictment for Rumsfeld, and there'll be an extradition order that will go out, and then it'll get rather interesting. And once that happens, then Mr. Rumsfeld better be very careful about where he travels. And the same thing is going to happen to Bush and Cheney once they're out of office, and they can no longer be protected as a head of state in that regard. But there is universal jurisdiction for the violation of international law, and there's absolutely no doubt that Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld are responsible for policies of torture. Now they can claim all they want to that we don't torture, but that's not true. They're lying through their teeth when they say that. The United States right now is in the business of torturing people. We've done it in the past, but right now we are torturing people to try to get information out of them, all in the name of the global war on terror. Now, the way they can get away with saying we don't torture is because they redefine what torture is.
Yes, yes.
It's sort of like, you know, if I shoot somebody in the head and kill them, and then or I shoot somebody in the heart and kill them, and they come to arrest me, and I say, well, no, you know, that's not murder. Murder is only when you shoot somebody in the head.
Yeah.
Right.
Say,
Right.
oh, okay,
Exactly.
so that wasn't murder when you shot him in the heart.
Right.
You didn't shoot him in the head, so it wasn't murder. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
right.
how they get away with it. They've redefined torture. And there's no doubt about this, and the documentary evidence is just enormous on this. We have all kinds of internal memorandums that have leaked out. Tom Engelhardt in his Tom Dispatch recently said it's the equivalent of the Pentagon Papers, only they've come out you know, one at a time. It's not like the whole thing got released all at one time like Ellsberg did with the Pentagon Papers, which laid bare the lying and the machinations that had gone on with regard to the Vietnam War. But we do have the same kind of voluminous documentary record about what they were doing, how they were redefining torture, how they were trying to implement policies of torture in various parts around the world. And you know, it's an enormously damning indictment of this administration. And right now, the United States government is responsible for torture. And it's just an incredible black stain on our government and on our people. And the further the stain is that we are not doing anything about it. I mean, this should be the basis for impeachment, right? I mean, if there's any kind of impeachable offense, it should be that our government has basically authorized the torture of individuals, whether they have good purposes or not. I mean, you know, okay, you know, the 9/11 attack certainly created fear and anxiety, and perhaps there's a need to go after terrorists and try to prevent another attack. But you cannot torture people, and of course we've tortured many innocent people, and torture is singularly ineffective in giving you the information that you need, and we know that. I mean, it's widely known. But they decided to, quote, take the gloves off, and that's a quote from Rumsfeld.
Right.
Take the gloves off, and they did take the gloves off, and what that meant was we are going to torture people, and they're continuing to do it today.
And Cheney said we may have to go to the dark side.
And we did. We went to the dark side. We went to the dark side, and it's so clear from the documentary evidence. But the media and the rest of the political establishment shies away from confronting this directly, although we do have a situation occurring right now where this has become an issue in the nomination of the Attorney General.
Yes, yes. And it's one specific aspect of the torture thing, but he is so careful, because if he does admit that it is torture, then what are the consequences of that for the whole Bush administration? So he's in a bad...
You're thinking McCasey.
Yeah,
again,
McCasey, right.
refusing to...
Right. I mean, if he acknowledges that it is torture, then what does that do to the Bush administration? I mean, then there's a smoking gun that the Attorney General to-be is announcing. So he's in a tough
And the
spot.
technique that in question is waterboarding.
Yes.
A technique where somebody is laid on a board, their head is covered with some kind of a cloth or cellophane, water is poured over their head, they can't breathe, their lungs start to fill up with water, they start literally drowning. And it's a technique that goes back to the Middle Ages. It was used in the Spanish Inquisition, it was used by the Japanese in World War II, it's been used numerous times in numerous places. but it's clearly a violation of international law. It's clearly against the 1984 Convention Against Torture and other forms of international law. And the United States is practicing it. And Cheney even gave it a sort of an implicit endorsement in an interview a year or so ago. And of course, the Attorney General nominee, Michael B. Mukasey, who's a federal judge, has been questioned about this by the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he has refused to render an opinion as to whether or not waterboarding is in fact a torture technique. And it so clearly is. And so here he is trying to be evasive and using all kinds of legalistic maneuvers to get around having to come out and say that in fact waterboarding does constitute torture.
Right.
And because of that, now the Senate Judiciary Committee has shown some gumption.
Right.
A number of senators have come out against his nomination, and he may be defeated at the Judiciary Committee level. It remains to be seen what's going to happen on that. If the nomination does get out of the Judiciary Committee, it's likely that Mukasey would be confirmed by the full Senate, unfortunately. But again, here's the top lawyer for the United States government, the top law enforcement official in the land, and he won't come out and say waterboarding is torture when it's absolutely clear that it is in fact illegal under international law. It is a torture technique that is banned. It is illegal. And yet he can't bring himself to say that it's illegal because he's trying to provide protection for the CIA, which has in fact engaged in this practice.
Sure.
Now, it shouldn't be the job of the chief law enforcement officer in the country to provide protection for people who have violated the law.
No.
That seems to be a rather strange conception, that he has to provide protection for people who might have broken the law. Shouldn't he be enforcing the law? Shouldn't he be going after people who have in fact broken the law? But he sees his role here to protect the CIA, and so that's a strange conception on his part.
Right.
And so that's where we're at with that. It's amazing that the Attorney General nominee will not come out and say that this technique is clearly illegal when it is.
I think it's a tremendous test for the Democrats. If they confirm him and put him through there, that's just such weakness that it's hard to stay with them with all that.
Yeah, yeah.
Gee.
Technically, Ron, what will allow the thing to go to the larger body for confirmation?
Well, the Senate, the Judiciary Committee could give a positive vote, and then the nomination will go to the full Senate.
Right.
Even if there's a negative vote, I think that the Senate Majority Leader can still bring it to the full Senate. But Harry Reid has said that if the Judiciary Committee does not come back with a positive vote, that he will not bring it to the full Senate. So, but it only takes one Democrat to break ranks. I mean, I think the committee's 10-9 Democrats, and so if one Democrat would break ranks, the Republicans will probably be solidly in favor. They won't break ranks, and so it'll end up. So it just takes one Democrat to be spineless and vote for Mukasey and for it to go to the full Senate.
Yeah, one of the things, they confirmed a very controversial judge over the past week from Mississippi who had a terrible record on civil rights. And I'm wondering if it's not the same thing here. What the Democrats really said in the background was, you know, look, we expect to take over the White House, and we don't want these guys to hold up our appointments to these offices. And I wonder if that's not in the back of their minds with this Attorney General hearings, too. But it's not a way out. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable.
No.
Well, it opens the door for other kinds of analysis of torture, which seems to me to be so self-evident. There's prima facie evidence is there about torture. And I was listening to the radio and had one of these oppositional discussions going on, and one guy was saying, well, I guess if the victim's lungs would fill with water, I could call that torture. But if the lungs don't fill with water, then I would be, I would not know, sort of, this kind of equivocation
That's torture.
I mean, yes, that's torture for me. I shut it off.
Well, it's tortured logic.
Yes,
Oh,
it's
it is.
tortured
Man.
logic.
Yeah.
But the idea that this is being subjected to that kind of logical scrutiny, as if the logic of the situation would prevail over the morality of the
Yes,
situation.
exactly.
And so
Exactly.
it concerns me that these kinds of what appear to me to be really dumb conversations about what is torture continue to go on, because the climate of opinion, because of so much of this kind of shilly-shallying around with Mukasey, you know.
With a sort of legal parsing and playing semantic games, you
Right.
know, is what's going on. And of course, what you raise is the fact that this is a broader moral issue. You know, as a moral stance, we ought to just, as a moral principle, we ought to just stand up and say we don't torture, and this is torture. You know, forget about all the legal shenanigans of how you define torture and all of that. It's clear this is torture under international law, and we ought to stand for that principle that we don't torture.
Yeah, yeah. Well, do you think he's going to get appointed?
I'm afraid that at least one Democrat will break ranks and it'll go to the full Senate and it'll be a close vote, but he'll get confirmed. There'll be a couple more Democrats and Lieberman, and that he'll be approved.
Boy, I hope that's not right.
But,
I just hope it doesn't happen. I mean, the international cost of this to our whole image as how can we ever speak about democracy?
Yeah, yeah. And of course, he's not very strong on detainee rights either, which is another issue that I think we might talk a minute about. He simply is not taking a kind of position I'm comfortable with.
About
unlawful combatants and
getting representation.
Getting representation, and the whole idea of closing Guantanamo. And this business about how do they describe it? It's a really tricky way. He hasn't been given the information that he needs yet
hasn't been briefed.
Hasn't been briefed, right? So that
he said that about the torture policy
Yeah.
as well. He hasn't been briefed on the waterboarding to know whether it's legal or not.
Please.
It's
yeah, give me a break.
Yeah. It's that kind of malarkey. Well, I noticed, Ron, you have another book, The Lawless World. Did you want to say something about that in our last few minutes here?
I have plugged it before,
Yeah.
but Philippe Sands, The Lawless World, I don't know if we can get a shot of this, but people that want to know a little bit more about international law might want to pick up this book. It's in paperback now. It's available in good bookstores around. But if you really wanted to understand the historical development of international law and how it applies to a variety of situations today, this is a very good book. And including, has a chapter on the Pinochet case and the precedent that it set, that a former head of state can be brought up on charges of violating international law. And it's got a couple chapters on Iraq, so it's really an outstanding introduction to international law for people that want to learn about that.
Yeah, and I think, again, referring to our discussion last time, I think these are the kind of books that build crap detectors. It's a way for people to find out something about what the other side looks like when it's clear and when it's truthful and when it's honest.
Right.
Which brings us to an earlier discussion we had about Karen Hughes. And the fact that she is leaving, she's leaving the administration. She resigned yesterday on the 31st. She was going to bring a beautiful picture of the United States to the world. It doesn't seem to have happened. All of the statistical information about the polls they've done in other countries indicate that we've tanked.
She was supposed to provide good PR for the United States, and she hasn't been able to do it. And I came across, at the very end of the New York Times article about her resignation, a quote from a former State Department official that I think really gets to the point of what happened here. This is Price Floyd, and he wrote that after he had resigned, he said, "I tried through the traditional domestic media and for the first time through the Arab media to reach people in the United States and abroad and convince them that we should not be judged by our actions, only by our words. So all of Karen Hughes's words couldn't overcome the actions of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, which, of course, have given us an enormous black eye in the world, and no amount of PR can overcome that.
Well, that is a wonderful place to leave.
Oh my gosh.
We hope you will join us again on our next Critical Issues Alternative Views. Ron, thank you, and Don, thank you. And I just like it when we can get together like this.
It's great.
So we look forward to seeing you back next time.